Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics Football. It's Fran here, and I'll be kind of looking at a Gameweek 7 wildcard team draft. This is going to be my initial draft, I think, for people who are prospectively looking to wildcard and why, I'd like to go for specific players using a template of 100 mil. There's going to be zero point 0.1 in the bank, but I understand that a lot of you guys would have had, price value rises in your team. You might have already had some of these players in your team, more than likely, to be honest. And because of that, you could actually probably upgrade a few players in this list if you can. But this is kind of built for players who might have slightly less value or need to think about downgrading. I think I'll talk about midfield options to downgrade in a bit, but I actually think that this defensive back line, maybe with the exception of Diaz, who could be rotated for someone like Cancelo at this point in time, for me is quite set and forget. I think the idea behind this team is you can play some sort of 4-4-3 structure, right? Or you can also play alternatively a 3-4-3 structure in a good game week. And that's why I've shown all the players who you would be rotating throughout the week. Of course, these are, five defenders, four midfielders, and three forwards. And of course, you have this kind of 4.5 bench option, maybe Sissoko or Douglas Luiz, right? It doesn't really matter too much. You can even go for Alan, who has had some hauls as well so far. But the idea, of course, is Alan would probably be sitting quite deep in your bench, and who knows, Livramento could actually come in and play sometimes, and Gallagher, who I think is maybe arguably the least talismanic midfield option here, is still a very, very fantastic option in good game weeks, and I think we saw that with the Brighton game as an example. But the idea, I think, if I explain the individual picks, is to go with, let's say, the very, very strong kind of premium elite defense. And we start with Trent, of course, who is a set and forget option. I do think Trent can actually be downgraded. I mean, if you really would like to keep a Liverpool defender, I think it makes the most sense to keep Van Dijk, who's probably the most nailed and doesn't have to deal with rotation as much, even though he is recovering from his injury. I think that allows, you to have another additional million. And maybe if you want to upgrade a midfielder and you trust in someone, let's say, you want to keep someone like Jota in your team, or you want to keep someone like Grealish in your team, then that could be a good, reasonable, I think, situation to drop someone like Trent. But I think you still want to have one Liverpool player in your team for the most part. And we know Trent is exceptional in the sense that if he plays, he is basically the lead chance creator across all defenders in the league, even if we include, Alonso and Reece James. I think just in terms of historical performance, I think, of course, with the Reece James injury, it's so unfortunate, but it also means that I think it somewhat strengthens the Alonso pick, not in terms of how nailed Alonso is, but just in terms of you don't have to make that kind of decision between who's the more interesting kind of fullback player who plays in a much more advanced position at times and takes a lot of set pieces for the team. With Reece James being out and Mount, for example, also being injured, Alonso's super interesting in terms of free kicks, corners. We saw, Chelsea become very close to scoring several corner goals just 2 match days ago. So I think he's a very interesting shout. And of course, when you look at the heat maps of Alonso, you'll see that he's basically almost playing like a deep lying left winger. In terms of Rudiger, I think there's nothing really that needs to be said. You could probably downgrade in terms of going from Rudiger to Christensen due to the Reece James injury and how that maybe impacts the Chelsea rotation, meaning that Christensen will probably play more games if you want to kind of save up on budget. So you can kind of go for Rudiger or Christensen in this situation here. But Rudiger, of course, represents someone who I think has a little bit more of attacking threat just in front of goal, maybe in set pieces. Unless Christensen maybe kind of bombards another long shot, kind of like in the Euros. But yeah, Rudiger is the most nailed option, in my opinion, in this kind of Chelsea backline alongside someone like Azpilicueta, right? And I think he makes the most sense as a double up with Alonso because you kind of have that balance of someone who might be maybe rotated with Chilwell at times and someone who's going to be playing consistent games and has the full faith of Tuchel at this point in time. Diaz, I think, is one of those options where you can kind of play either a riskier card or a safer card. I think Diaz is clearly the safer card, and that's why I have him in this kind of team selection. But you can easily kind of move away and go for Cancelo. I think the argument for Diaz is the fact that in a game that's very tame and I think very quiet, you can see that Diaz sometimes will get more bonus points than Cancelo. It's a bit of a toss-up, right? But Cancelo, of course, has more opportunities to actually get assists, and he does play in very advanced positions. Cancelo is not necessarily fully nailed, but I think the beneficial thing about Cancelo and having him in your team is the fact that now I think with maybe Zinchenko not being in maybe Pep's mind and also maybe slightly having some sort of niggle, I think Cancelo can kind of comfortably play between the left back and right back position. Maybe he's kind of reclaimed that, I guess, the full faith of Pep in terms of being able to start each game. And I think he's shown that over the course of the season. He might still have to deal with rotation. I think Diaz is once again much less rotation prone over the course of the full season. And that's why I probably would still go with Diaz at this point in time. But there could even be a point in the season where, let's say, you move away from these two Chelsea defenders and maybe move into Cancelo, especially since you actually already have a very, very strong depth in terms of bench, like a kind of bench midfield in your team. Livramento just rounds out the defenders. I think he makes the most sense due to the fact that at 4.2, you're not really seeing any player who has maybe consistent holes in terms of clean sheets, which we've already seen so far. Yes, they kind of failed versus Wolves. I would say that came down to individual performances of some of the centre backs and Romeo as well, and their incapability to kind of deal with Jimenez. I think they were still overpowering Wolves in that game, and ultimately for a 4.2, defender, we're not asking for clean sheets every week. Brighton, for example, with Duffy, isn't the most interesting option as an example. Livramento can also still he still has the full faith, I think, in my opinion, of Hasenhüttl to actually play, 90 minutes or 80 minutes at least every game. And he does constantly provide kind of attacking opportunities for his side and will probably actually get maybe some attacking hauls eventually this season, as long as Gineppo doesn't actually whiff those chances when he's maybe half a meter away from the box. Um, in terms of midfield, I think it's actually quite solid. I think the two core pieces, in my opinion, at this point in time, I think with a big kind of qualifier is Salah and Rafinha. I think is unquestionably the best midfielder in the game in terms of the fact that you want to have him as a consistent captaincy shout. I've already made a lot of mistakes this season in terms of dropping points by not going for Salah as a captain. And yeah, I have to just hold my hands up and say that, simply put, he's having a fantastic season. I think the pieces around him are much more stronger in terms of how often he gets touches now in the system. And yeah, I think Salah is going to have a fantastic year ahead, and I can't see why you would ever take him out of your team. He has to stay. With Rafinha, I think it's just a qualifier in terms of his injury, right? And what kind of situation is going on there. We've seen in the last two games that he still had fantastic hauls very early in the game, and he was able to kind of move in from this kind of right wing position to kind of drift into the center, which was something I think was much more apparent when Bamford was out and Rodrigo was playing as the striker. I wonder whether this kind of changes Bielsa's mind in terms of whether Bamford can maybe improves his team or not. But I have really liked Rafinha's positioning in the West Ham game. I think in the first half he was lights out, to be honest. He probably could have scored 2 or 3 goals in my opinion in that kind of game when he was making these very good drifts into the center kind of 10 spot where he would actually take fantastic shots. In terms of just generally his creativeness as well, I think he hasn't gotten many assists this season, but you can see that he takes corners. He also whips the ball in very, very often. And I think inevitably he'll get assists and kind of points from that kind of perspective. And I think with the fixtures, with Rafinha being so good, as long as we kind of have a little bit more certainty in terms of injury situation and maybe the kind of international situation as well, I think he's a fantastic option. I think the next most kind of contentious pick is going to be Gallagher, right? Who sits alongside Rafinha in this midfield. I think Gallagher is interesting because for me, I think he is more talismanic than maybe picking between one of the kind of Everton players. I know a lot of the Everton players have already hauled, and I'll discuss midfield and kind of options in a brief stint. I think it's actually worth looking at some of the other differentials who sit in the midfield and some of the great haulers that we've already seen this season in Benrahma. I'm not dismissing them. I'm basically just suggesting that I would be more tempted to have Gallagher be a bench piece week to week, and kind of utilize him for big games because I do think he plays a talismanic role for the team. And in terms of Sarr, I think, yeah, he's clearly a talisman for Watford. I would say actually, he seems like someone who can be held, I think, until game week 15, especially now that you have a very, very strong depth and kind of bench in this side, right? Sarr is someone who probably is going to haul versus the weaker sides that he faces, but we've seen, of course, in years past that he has the capacity to overwhelm top tier defenses, right? Liverpool's defense, were kind of proven to be not impervious versus Brentford, and I think whilst I'm not basically asking Sarr to have a fantastic performance, I still think he could hold, and he has hauled, historically versus this exact same Liverpool defense. So I think he's an interesting pick and someone who you can actually hold longer. I think previously we were thinking about Sarr as a pick who was a bit more short term, and whilst that is somewhat correct, I would say ultimately his competition, in around this kind of price range are ultimately other mid-table teams, right? And a lot of these players are not going to haul week on week, and that goes the same with Sarr. But I think he's potentially the most explosive player in your midfield, and you kind of want to have one of these differential shouts who remains in your team as a very interesting option. The forward line I think is actually less. Requires less explanation, to be honest. I think maybe the most contentious pick is going to be Saint Maximin, who is someone who actually features in my own side and someone who I actually replaced Bamford with. I think Antonio and Lukaku, I don't really have to explain much about them. I think I'll talk about them in terms of team selection maybe just a bit later, because you might be interested in terms of how you'd like to captain and vice captain game week 7. But I think the reason why I talk about Saint Maximin is because I kind of like going down in terms of players, in terms of downgrading them, right? Say Maximin's at this kind of 6.7, 6.8 price right now, and he has the opportunity to go down to someone like Tony in the future, post game week 10, where I think Brentford actually start to once again have a very good run of games where they can actually probably attack a lot of teams. And I think you can see that Tony and someone like Mbeumo as well is clearly a very talismanic option. I think those kind of Brentford players are going to be super interesting in the future. And I would strongly consider, looking at these players. They could also, for example, if you, let's say, decide to use Tony now and maybe try to save some costs now, maybe if you downgrade Trent, as I argued with the Van Dijk thing, you can once again strengthen your team and maybe improve another midfielder if you really must want to do that, especially if you, let's say, don't think Sarr is a consistent hauling option, right? And that's pretty much how I would actually describe the structure of this team. I think it's all about maybe arguably getting things right in terms of the game week and making sure that you don't leave points in the bench, which is, of course, I think maybe a kind of quintessential trap that I think a lot of managers that play FPL kind of fall into. But I do think that with these mid-table sides, you can pick the right game weeks where you play the right players, and sometimes you accept the fact that you'll get them wrong. But I think most of these players are so talismanic and key to their sides that they will ultimately haul most of the time when you actually select them correctly. In terms of the actual game week itself, I think the team selection has to be, going for Rafinha and maybe dropping Gallagher in the midfield, going for a midfield three, keeping the back four potentially. Maybe if you actually have a little bit of a gut feeling in terms of the Liverpool Man City game, you can make a decision between maybe dropping one of Trent and Diaz. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it myself. I feel like it's very possible with City being such a good defense that they keep a clean sheet. But at the same time, even if Trent doesn't keep a clean sheet, I can still see attacking dividends from him, which would be huge from a defender, right? Alonso and Rudiger, I think you'd play them this week, and you bench Livramento for obvious reasons. And the front line pretty much plays itself for most weeks, I think, with Antonio, Lukaku, and say Maximan. But going back into, the actual midfield differential itself, I've left out a lot of names that maybe you guys have been thinking about, over the course of the recent game weeks. And a lot of them come from Everton and Arsenal. And of course, our very own favorite, Benrahma. I think Saka and Emil Smith Rowe, of course, had a fantastic kind of game versus Spurs, and you can actually click on the kind of card above to actually see that kind of tactical analysis and what I actually think about them as assets, maybe more in depth and with freeze frame analysis. But for me, I think the reason why I like Saka and Smith Rowe is the fact that when they actually play, let's say Saka right wing and Emil Smith Rowe on the left wing, I think that is the most kind of attacking outlet of Arsenal, where they can kind of play on the overlap and the underlap, whereas I think they're somewhat more regimented and restricted when Pepe plays on the right hand side and Saka plays on the left. In this structure where, let's say, Emil Smith Rowe gets to play on the left and Odegaard plays in the 10 spot, I think both these assets are very interesting. But the only issue that I have is I don't have any kind of securities or understanding of what Arteta wants to do in the future. So, if he's not interested in, let's say, continuing with this structure that actually worked really well for Spurs, I'm not so confident about them as options. With the Everton options, it's so interesting, right? Because Gray has, of course, consistently hit some very, very good price rises. And he's been a very solid option for players who've had him for a while now, especially since the DCL and Richarlison injuries. But, ironically, Townsend and Doucouré have continued to have fantastic hauls alongside him. And it becomes really hard to actually pick who's the kind of right Everton midfield you want to pick. I'd also say that, they've benefited from having some of the nicer fixtures kind of go by them. And maybe we're kind of arriving at a patch where they'll start to slow down in terms of their actual consistent hauls. You can even see it someone like Alan, for example, at 4.6, who actually has 2 assists. So it's kind of crazy to think about that. But I wouldn't maybe stay away from them simply because I don't actually know who is the best option to pick, especially when maybe DCL Richarlison comes back. They could take somewhat less key roles, right? With Townsend, that he's maybe off penalties if Richarlison comes back. With Gray, potentially, you might be dealing with a situation where he becomes less talismanic as a figure. I still think he's a fantastic option. Maybe if I had to pick a gut option between the three of them, I'd still go with Gray. But I can't disregard the fact that Doucouré has actually outscored all three of them. Even though he's just a box-to-box midfielder, right? Which we usually don't like to pick in FPL for obvious reasons. With Benrahma, I think it's very simple. I think you look at the game versus Leeds, you see the bonus point, you realize that he's actually a very, very kind of effective talismanic player for West Ham, even though he hasn't hauled in maybe 2 or 3 weeks, barring the Man United goal. And I think for that reason, I think it's hard to maybe justify maybe keeping Benrahma in your team when Rafinha looks a little bit more interesting in terms of how recent his hauls have been. But Benrahma still remains a great option. I think it's just the fact that when you compare him with Rafinha at that price range, He's just got slightly worse fixtures, and I think that's what it comes down to. And that's pretty much how I would assess the midfielders right now. In terms of the future, I think there's also the great punt of Mbemo as well when the Brentford fixtures turn. So I think you have the option to maybe switch away from someone like Sarr or Gallagher if they're not working out for you in the very near future, and actually go for someone like Mbemo, who basically, well, next year, in my opinion, will be an out of position player, and recognizes that. So he should be moved into a forward because of how offensive he is in his team. And that's pretty much all I have for this video in terms of the wild card. Thank you so much for listening to the video, and I hope you guys have a lovely week ahead.